Good afternoon, late afternoon here in the monastery, and we're broadcasting, we'll likely put this on YouTube, but it's really for Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting.ca. As some of you have noticed, we've been doing a little discussions a few times on, I don't know, overworked word, but on new paradigms or changing paradigms. The last one was, we used the metaphor of a tsunami to show how law, ethics and morality have come into conflict. And it's really important to talk about it because we do have to communicate with the rest of the world. We're not just communicating internally and not in just one particular level of church life. So we have to realize that not only paradigm shifts, but a new demographic reality. I think probably it was experienced somewhat down in the United States during the recent presidential election. And some people were surprised, particularly in some states, at how the vote went. And the thing that had not been taken into consideration was, first of all, the demographic changes, and secondly, a huge paradigm shift. A shift in mentality and the way people understand things, partly driven by technology, partly by normal evolutionary processes, and partly by the kind of communications that people share now, and how immediate communications are, the amount of information that's available. Today I want to touch a little bit on neurolaw. We've talked a bit about neurobiology. Some of you will not be familiar with the concept of neurolaw. Developments in neurobiology and the understanding of the human brain, how it works, have actually challenged the courts and challenged law itself. So we have to touch on it because it also challenges many of the ways in which we approach morality and underlying problems with ethics. We've come to a point where we can no longer try to communicate the faith to a broader spectrum of people who need it and many who actually want it, particularly the Orthodox faith. We can't really be communicating it with superstitions, with mythologies, with doctrinal ideas that have been well proved to be wrong. We're not talking about the basic dogmas of faith, of course, but things that became part of an ideology and are now being strongly challenged and justly challenged and proved to be, frankly, as wrong as the idea that Galileo challenged. When we begin to discover more and more about how the brain works, we have to, first of all, bring ourselves in a little and not talk only about, say, external demons, temptations for external demons, and that sort of thing. We're all familiar with various temptations that the world just in general has to offer us. Societies, cultures, materialism, the idea that God's will for us is that we all be rich or prosperous, and that somehow, in some societies, that the poor are cursed, the rich are blessed, and things contrary to the gospel. But we see a lot of these. And we also see people demanding that people take responsibility in ways and places and times and circumstances in which they can have no responsibility. This has come before the law courts now a number of times, and it's actually altered whether someone was convicted or not convicted, or whether they were remanded to a psychiatric hospital instead of a prison, and the number of months or years in which people have been assigned to prison. We learned a long time ago that punitive justice is absolutely useless at reducing crime rates, taking people out of the crime circuits. Restorative justice has always been much more effective. However, we also know that people who commit violent crimes sometimes cannot be changed. They cannot be rehabilitated. This is true of certain psychopathic conditions and true of other mental conditions, some of which could have resulted from damage to areas of the brain or birth defects in the brain. All number of subjects that we'll cover little by little, because with God's help we'll do a little series on the brain and what we now know about the brain and how it functions, and try to put it at a level so that almost all the viewers will be able to follow it. But one point I really want to make is that we cannot continue, some of people who continue, to rail against new discoveries in science in defense of things that are clearly superstitions, clearly mythologies, or simply obsolete ways of understanding things, obsolete science, obsolete medicine. We don't treat people any longer by shaking gourds full of seeds that rattles over people's head and making incantations. We also don't treat people with certain kinds of remedies that used to be used that sometimes made people more ill. Those of you who, like me, lived in a pre-antibiotic age, where very often wounds could be treated with kerosene because at least it would kill the bacteria or viruses, mostly the bacteria, and we wouldn't end up with blood poisoning. Then we developed antibiotics. We discovered a great deal more about how the body works, how infections work. We dispelled the idea that all illness is caused by demonic possession. We found out what used to be called the divine illness or the divine disease, that is epilepsy. We came to the realization that many supposed visions, which took place under epileptic seizures and actually disoriented the faith in some cases, disoriented the teachings of the church, disoriented Christianity in general, and disoriented society in many ways. We go back to the ancient church fathers, and some will be amazed to learn that people like St. Basil the Great, St. John Chrysostom, and other of the great church fathers understood clearly the difference between a psychiatric illness and demonic possession. They didn't confuse the two. In the Byzantine Empire, refuges were built for people with psychiatric illnesses, refuges based solely on compassion, because, of course, there was little way to treat things in those days. Well, we began to develop and understand what parts of the brain are affected. We realized that the hegemonicon, that is the chief, all the senses and the things that direct the body, are in the brain, not the heart. And we learned that injuries to certain parts of the brain cause certain kinds of physical impairment. We also learned that in recent times that a tumor or a cyst in a certain part of the brain can cause behavior that is considered both immoral and illegal. And in those cases, the removal of the tumor or the removal of the cyst can bring to an end that kind of behavior. For example, an example we've given before, we had a female school teacher, I believe in Washington, D.C. You can find it online in Science Magazine report. Suddenly became a pedophile, and she was after very young boys in the school for sexual relations. It was discovered that she had a tumor, I believe in the prefrontal lobe, some area, and pressing on a certain part of the brain. When the tumor was removed, she had no feelings of pedophilia again. The same happened to a man, and I'm sure it was in the Washington, D.C. area, who suddenly became a pedophile, and even went so far as to try to seduce his young niece. He was going after very young women, young girls. Whilst he was in jail awaiting trial, the headaches that he had been having became so severe that they were intolerable. So they took him to Johns Hopkins University, if I recall, hospital, and they discovered he had a tumor in much the same place where the woman's tumor was. And upon removing the tumor, he had absolutely no feelings whatsoever of pedophilia again, until the tumor grew back. And then the pedophilia returned. Removed the tumor, pedophilia disappeared. So we know that many of these things are affected by something that's going on in the brain. Pressure in prefrontal lobe can cause behavior that's totally uncharacteristic of a person, and brain injuries, say from a fall or automobile accident, any number of things that can damage the skull and the brain. Then eventually there develops after that totally uncharacteristic behavior of the person, and it's easy to rush to judgment. However, what is happening is the damage to very often the prefrontal cortex, the lobe in the front, has created this situation where this uncharacteristic behavior develops and comes out. So there are so many things developing in neurobiology that it now affects the law. And it also has to affect the way in which we teach certain things. We cannot go on with some kind of primitive, almost superstitious and mythological ideas any longer, because we won't convince anybody. And all we'll do ultimately is hold Christianity up as a laughingstock, something just to make jokes about. This is something to seriously consider. I'm hoping that in some of the seminaries, a little bit of neurobiology would be taught, as well as some basic science. Teaching the philosophers to some great degree, while the philosophers were part of the great human conversation, they have very little to say to the 21st century. We don't depend on philosophies and philosophers so much anymore. We depend on the sciences, and we try to understand them within the context of our faith. So I want to call upon people who are involved as clergy or in some way in leadership in the church to learn a little more about what's actually taking place and the new information and the new knowledge that are coming before us that we have to assimilate. Because if you stop to think about it, if a question comes up, most of the time somebody will Google to find the answer or go on one of the search engines, and they'll find an answer at least. And most of the answers they find will be sound and solid. They just need to be pursued in more depth. So we're talking now about human consciousness, to what degree man has free will. I'm actually carrying on an international conversation on both these subjects at the moment with people, scientists, neurobiologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, medical doctors, even in Iran, in Pakistan, in India, in China, in Britain, in Germany, in the United States, in Canada. And we're all sharing information, research papers, and trying to reach some consensus about some of these matters. We have to rein in a little bit to the degree to which we think people have an absolute free will. We have to take into account things that happen in the brain, including injuries, including skull fractures, and things that take place in football or baseball or in the trades where people become injured. We also have to take genetics into account, and we've got to kind of focus ourselves on something now that is meaningful and believable and actually true. So this is what I want to call on people. You know, sometimes I get questions asked on some of the broadcasts. Some sincere and honest questions, some questions that come from confusion, some questions that are sort of moderately angry, partly because of the conflict in the ways of thinking, and some who are absolutely malicious and absolutely determined to put forward things that we know very well are simply superstitions and mythologies over against realities and truth. The Orthodox faith is capable of encountering everything that comes along in this world and enriching whatever it encounters, and enriching humanity, and enriching our relationship with Christ, our knowledge, our understanding of those things that are beyond science. But it cannot do it when it's being crippled by some kind of fundamentalism, hysteria, or indecipherable fears. And by people who froze in their minds at a given era or a given time. We have to move into the real concrete knowledge that's been gained or being gained. I understand that some of these developments in neuroscience are so powerful that they're reshaping the law, and the laws will be changed because of neurobiology and what's being discovered. We, of course, never changed the basic dogmas of the faith, but we have some accreted doctrines that are not really essentially part of our dogmatic system. There are ways that people have interpreted constructs in the far past that have now been proved to be in error. Some completely wrong, some dangerously wrong. And remember that once upon a time people believed that witches could actually fly on brooms and cast spells. Well, some people still believe that, but it's not true. We've come a long way in developing knowledge and understanding of the universe, the earth upon which we live, and the human person and the human brain. And the motives that drive people to do things, and the times when responsibility is sometimes curtailed through, again, brain injuries, severe accidents, genetics, people in war who have had explosions too close to them or inhaled certain chemicals. All of these things can change the brain structure in ways that produce uncharacteristic or unwanted behavior. And consequently, we have to try to discover how, as lay people, as clergy, as hierarchs, we can assimilate some of this knowledge and understanding and place it in the context of how we use the church as a spiritual hospital. The more we know about the problems that arise in the brain, the more likely we are to come to some kind of cure for some of these things. Whether it's Parkinson's disease, which after all is a mental illness because it takes place with the brain chemistry. Multiple sclerosis is really a mental illness of sorts because it arises from misinformation or wrongful information coming from parts of the brain. So with real psychiatric illnesses, bipolar disease and schizophrenia and all these other problems, the more we know about all of these things, the better we can possibly treat them. Things like kleptomania, which can now be treated fairly successfully because of new ways of imaging the brain, functional MRIs. And we have a whole host of new ways of imaging the brain and seeing what's going on in it. So I just want to ask you again not to be too absolute about various judgments, but let's try to look and perhaps study this together on our broadcast. We'll think together about these things and try to see how we can be in a better position to be the kind of spiritual healers that we're called upon to be in the spiritual hospital which the church is called upon to be. And to do that without being spiritual witch doctors, but actual spiritual healers. So that's why I wanted to chat about these things from time to time. And we'll do a little series on the brain and discuss some of these issues that can take place within the brain and how we might encounter them and cope with them. But thank you all for listening. And please join us and send your comments, whether they're confused, positive, or even whether they're hateful or malicious, that's fine. But if you're going to say something hateful or malicious, ask a question also, so they'll have something to respond to in the question. And your input really is valuable. I love hearing from you, and it gives me a chance to think more when I have your questions put before me. Thank you, and God bless you.